Hi, my name is Kelly Fraser and I am currently a senior at Washington State University. I am in pursuit of my undergraduate degree in human development and I will be graduating this coming May with my Bachelor of Arts degree. Through my time working in a Head Start preschool, I have found a lot about myself and I now have a better understanding of my own abilities as well as some struggles that I may face as a teacher. In terms of my strengths, I find that I am a very understanding and empathetic person. I really strive to understand other students' needs, and I'm very committed to making a difference in their lives as well as their schooling. One challenge that I found that I face is that I myself haven't experienced any great struggles that have really impacted my schooling. Therefore, I do find it difficult to always relate to a student who is facing these obstacles. However, this merely fuels my desire to lessen these hardships for my students. So one challenge I may face becoming a teacher is working with children in poverty. The topic that we'll be discussing today is poverty, not bad teachers, is what plagues our schools.
I'm Paige Thompson. I am an education major and have an endorsement in special education.
And I'm Lacey Taylor, and I'm an early childhood education major.
I also agree with Ask's stance on this topic. I do think that it is poverty that can be detrimental to a child's well-being and their level of education that they may attain.
I think that Ask makes a really good point in that we're always so worried about how behind we are in education, but really we're comparing two completely different situations where I really liked his point about how schools with the same level of poverty compared to the average level of poverty in Finland or other countries, we were doing similarity. And so obviously it's not necessarily our problem in our schools or bad teachers, it's really maybe the problems outside of school that we need to conquer first.
I agree. I think there's so many factors that go into a child's schooling rather than what happens at school. For example, with the poverty, there's so many things that happen at home. There's stress in the home environment, especially when there's money issues. There's physiological problems where children aren't getting the necessary nutrition, they're not sleeping as well, those kinds of things that really impact how a child is just going into a day of schooling.
I also agree. I think poverty does play a big factor, and it also affects how we teach. So if we're not getting the funding we need, we're not going to be considered a good teacher.
I also agree with that, just because teachers that are being paid more are likely in an area where there's more funding for schools. It's a better quality area rather than areas where there's poverty, and therefore teachers who are getting paid more are much more inclined to work in those schools and to be a part of the classroom and really put their full effort in.
And just access to materials as well. I went to a really low-income high school, and all throughout my educational career, we did not have the science materials or the computer materials, the technology that schools in higher income areas would have had. And when I came to the university, I really realized how much of a disadvantage that was. And that wasn't my teacher's fault in any way. They were definitely trying their best with what we had, but just because of the funding that my school had or the lack of, we really were at a disadvantage. And I know my education suffered a little because of that.
And I actually had the opposite experience where I was in a more higher income area where we had access to all this technology and all that stuff, where I do feel like I was not necessarily in what I actually learned, but I was at an advantage in terms of I knew how this technology worked, and which is a really big part of where our society is at today. So I do feel like that there is an advantage to being in a higher quality school district and a higher quality educational system.
Technology for sure plays a big role in education now, so it makes sense. You're at a disadvantage if there isn't funding for that type of thing.
Yeah. Another thing going with teachers is I think that there's a certain stigma against children who are maybe impoverished, or even children with special needs and that kind of thing, where some teachers may even think that, oh, they're just not going to succeed in life. What's the point of giving that extra effort to them, where really these children are the ones that need that extra effort. So I think that that stereotype that's placed on them, where they may not get the equal opportunities that other children get to experience, I think that's another thing that really puts schools at a disadvantage, schools that are in poverty versus those that are in higher quality.
Yeah, I think that students that are in poverty could even enter the educational field in kindergarten or even preschool at a disadvantage, because if their family is under a high stress environment, their family won't have time to, just simple things like reading to their child, or just taking the time to have conversations with them, or answer their questions about what they see and what they're observing. And those are such important early childhood educational experiences, and then those children don't get that. So they could be just entering kindergarten at a disadvantage.
Yeah, and it also establishes those roles in a family, in that children who maybe are living in those high stress environments won't get that affection that they need from their parents, and it doesn't allow them to establish that attachment style and those bonds with their parents, which can really affect the way that they interact with their peers at school or with their teachers at school, which can lead to a child who's perceived as different, goes to school and gets bullied because they're different, so they don't establish social relationships. Then they don't want to go to school because they're made fun of for being impoverished, especially if it's in an area where poverty isn't the norm.
I feel like we almost create the stigma ourselves by, I guess, putting a negative connotation to the fact that there isn't parental involvement. And I think kids are smart. They know.
Yeah.
And they see those kind of things. So,
have you seen any of this in your Head Start experience, Kelly?
Yeah, I'm currently working in a Head Start preschool, and probably about 70% of our children are low income. A majority of them are from different countries, so their families don't speak English. So there's definitely a language barrier. The children have sometimes won't come to school showered. They come in the same clothes that they've been wearing all week. So it definitely is just, in terms of a social situation, the kids they don't make friends as easily because they're perceived as dirty, or if older, even though it's a preschool, there's certain kids that perceive them as not as smart because they don't speak English, and they just don't get those needs met at home, which transfers over to the way they're learning in school, because most of the children who are in the Head Start program in our preschool, they are much lower in terms of their educational abilities than the other children that are in there, and we try to give them the extra attention, but it really is difficult for them to kind of grasp a lot of the concepts that we're learning.
Another issue that children in poverty might experience is just a difficulty getting to school because of their lack of transportation. Like, if the bus is irregular, or if the routes don't go very close to their house, or if their parents just aren't very good about making sure that they're getting to school, that could be a very big issue that they could be missing a lot of days.
Yeah, and a lot of times families may have a car 1 minute, and then something happens where that's the first thing that often goes if they have a financial crisis or something of that nature. So you start with having a car and being able to drive your kids to school every day, and then what do? You have to go figure out the bus routes, or you could, if you live somewhere in the city, you could take a cab maybe, but then you have to pay for that. So it's just, there's so many options, but all of them just kind of contribute to that financial crisis that a lot of families experience and that they face.
Another issue that kids might face is not getting breakfast in the morning, which is really essential, especially at a young age. If kids are showing up hungry, they're not going to be able to focus in class at all. So not going to be successful. Yeah,
and we're taught our entire lives that breakfast is the most essential meal of the day, and I mean, every kid always has lunch at school, and it's always a difference. Do you bring lunch? Do you buy it? And then you weigh the nutritional needs of those. So children in poverty who may bring lunch, it may be an apple or half of a sandwich. It may not be what is nutritionally expected or what's really healthy for them. One thing we do in our Head Start program, which I really think is great, is we provide breakfast and lunch and a snack to all of our children, those in Head Start and those not in Head Start. So it really fulfills that nutritional need that children really need, especially young children, that they need every day, just because when you have that nutritional value in you and you're able to eat, it just fuels your ability to learn and retain information and that kind of stuff, which I think is really important. And all of this kind of ties into Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where he lists the different needs that every child has or any person has in order. So for example, one of them is the physiological needs that a child needs. So that's food and water and sleep. And a child may not get the necessary sleep because they, like Lacey said, they may live in a high stress environment where it's hard for them to fall asleep, or they live with 3 or 4 other brothers and sisters in the same room, so it's just really difficult for them. And another aspect of the hierarchy of needs is just the security needs. So going back to a child's living situation, if they're living in a high stress environment, or if they're living in a tent or a motorhome or something of that nature, it's a far different experience than a child who lives in a 4-bedroom, 2-garage house in a comfortable neighborhood. And so they'll just really get such a different experience. And then another one that ties in with the poverty aspect is just the social needs that he discusses. So the affection that a child gets at home from their parents, and like I said before, establishing those bonds. And it can really also tie back into what I talked about with the bullying before, and the relationships they form at school with their peers. And if they're feeling that they're an outcast, they're not going to want to go to school, which in turn affects their schooling abilities and the rates of dropout and all of those factors. So I really think that poverty really does have a pretty big impact on the schools that we have in the United States. And in comparison with those around the world, I do think that the negative effects that poverty can have is what quote-unquote plagues our schools, rather than not necessarily the quality of teachers that we have, because there is a certain criteria that every teacher must meet. So I wouldn't think that there are bad teachers out there per se.